it's a time where we want to take risk. We have to take risks, we have to make investments, and we have to do things that we hadn't imagined possible before at a speed that we haven't moved before.
The Liberals claim that if you elect them for a fourth term, that they will be different than the first 3 terms. Well, we know that that's not true. The only way to get a change is by putting Canada first, by electing a new Conservative government.
Prime Minister Mark Carney and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre were out today, days ahead of an expected election call. Sunday is that date to circle on your calendar, folks. That's when we expect the federal campaign to officially start. The majority of opinion polls are showing the Liberals and Conservatives are in a statistical tie. Here to break down the numbers on the election eve is Abacus Data founder, chair, and CEO David Coletto. David, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Good evening.
I want to start with how far we've come and where we are right now. When you compare how people felt back in December compared to right now, how big of a swing have you seen, David?
I mean, it's a completely different landscape, and I think for most Canadians, their mindset has shifted, right? For most of 2023 and 2024, they were focused like a laser on how their lives have become more difficult, more expensive, healthcare harder to get, housing, harder to find and to pay for. And that culminated into, the lowest approval ratings we've seen for the federal Liberals ever, and eventually so much pressure that Justin Trudeau had no choice but to step aside. Fast forward literally a few days after that, and Donald Trump gets inaugurated and starts threatening us with a whole bunch of things, including, erasing arbitrary borders between our 2 countries. And you now have Canadians who are far more focused on the long term, on what the uncertainty of Donald Trump, his tariffs, his threats mean for us. And the result is a complete swing. You go from a 25-point Conservative lead at the end of December. We have them still slightly ahead, but that gap is closing. And that red line on any chart, on any pollster, is pretty steep. And the move has been pretty substantial.
Yeah, and they're coming close to sort of a crossing or meeting. Now, you've said in the past that the fundamental change has been the job description that Canadians are hiring for in this position. Tell us how that has changed.
Well, again, I think for the last 2 years, Canadians were frustrated. They were angry in some ways, and they blamed a lot of what they were feeling on the federal government, and in particular, Justin Trudeau. And I think Pierre Poilievre perfectly summed up and captured that feeling and litigated, like a trial lawyer almost in a courtroom, the case. And we were all the jury. And he connected with us, he empathized with us, and he displayed our anger at the defendant, if I'm going to take that analogy all the way. But today, I think Canadians are increasingly worried the country itself is at risk. And so they're looking, I think, for somebody who, one, is firm and tough, who has experience, who knows how to handle a crisis. And they're also looking for some comfort and security from that person. I've described it almost like a physician, right? Who is the best in their field, has the best medicine available to them, but also can hold our hand and tell us we're going to get through this. And that's a different job than the one I think Canadians were hiring for just a few weeks ago.
So how much do you think that people are going to be looking in this campaign and how they'll be casting the ballot? Policy versus the person leading the party. How will that factor in?
Yeah, I mean, Kim Campbell told us that elections are not a time to debate policies, and I don't think that's always the case. But I think in this case, we're not likely going to see deep divides or debates about policy. I think Canadians still care about the outcomes. They care about a number of issues like affordability, healthcare, housing. But at the end of the day, I think they're looking for the person who is going to guide them, the team that's going to lead the country over the next 4 to 5 years, and the counterpoint, I think, to both the chaos and uncertainty that Donald Trump's creating. So it's very much going to be a character election more than, I think, a policy. At least that's how we're starting right now.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we can see that the Liberals and Conservatives are certainly playing in that sandbox right now. But those issues that you just brought up, affordability and healthcare, those aren't going away. And typically, those are the ones that are really sort of played to by the NDP and Bloc Québécois when they're trying to make those the ballot box question. Do you think that there's a world where they can bring that back to the fore and try and make this ballot box question about those issues?
I mean, there's a chance. I think it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be really hard. I mean, we've seen a test drive of this in the Ontario election where the opposition parties tried to make it about something other than Donald Trump and the provincial government there's response to it. And they made some progress, but not enough to change the way that voters were looking at that choice. And Doug Ford easily won that election. And so in Canada, as we head into this federal election, I think it's less again about those specific issues. And you saw it in the two clips you showed, right? Like you have Pierre Poilievre today still beating the drum of change and saying you're not going to see different outcomes unless you change the government, and the Liberals are the Liberals are the Liberals. Whereas Mark Carney is talking about the bigger picture, about what needs to be done. And I think there's this tension, and that's why in the polls, there's not this overwhelming wave one way or the other, that I still think Canadians are trying to figure out what is that. And we may not actually get to a judgment on this. We may actually get a really close outcome because half the country thinks this is about change and half the country thinks this is about Trump. And as a result, and that's a really hard place for the New Democrats to be, mind you, we see consolidation towards those two parties that best represent each one of those.
Yeah, and then you have all these external factors, or the big external factor, like U.S. President Donald Trump, who even today said that he would prefer to deal with a liberal than a conservative in government here. So do you think that that could play with Canadian voters?
I think it could, but on the other hand, and we're in the field now, so come back to me next week, Mike, and I'll give you a better sense of whether that like so-called endorsement is moving the number. I think if you don't like Donald Trump, and keep in mind, close to 80% of Canadians don't have a positive view of him, you're probably not buying what he's saying. And so I think it suggests that frame could work if people ultimately believe that Mark Carney cannot deal with Donald Trump, that he does not have both the ability and the plan to see us through it. But he's starting in a position where they do. And so it's going to be incumbent on now the Conservatives to make the case that he's not the right person to do it. There's one other really interesting thing about this election. I can't think of one in which the leader of the opposition is better known and more people are familiar with him than with the sitting prime minister. And so inevitably, in a weird way, although Mark Carney is the incumbent, Pierre Poilievre is actually more well known. And so that's still a variable in all this. And people, while they are getting to know Mark Carney, they still don't know him very well. And I think are going to be watching closely in these first few days of how he performs when all eyes will be on this campaign.
Yeah, and certainly we'll be watching as well. And I'm sure we'll have you back next week to see how that Trump factor has really made it through your numbers. Abacus Data founder and chair, also CEO, David Coletto, thanks for joining us. Appreciate this.
Thanks so much. Have a great weekend.